The Foreign Office needs to be re-empowered because a lot of this is just being done by a little group of people in Number 10. And now that we've got David Cameron there, I hope that the Foreign Office, in its more measured way, with a deeper historical understanding, can shape British policy in a much more mature manner.
You think that the UK has failed to challenge Israel for years. On what?
Well, I think the origin of the deep problem in the Middle East is basically the Israelis taking land which is not theirs. The reason you've got hundreds of thousands of people marching in London and indeed in many other cities all over the world is that people's sense of justice is offended by the fact that illegal Israeli settlers are taking Palestinian land, bashing up the Palestinians and pushing them out of their own houses and their own territory. That's the origin. And I'm afraid what I think has happened as Netanyahu's government became ever more extreme is that not enough people challenged him and said, hold on, back down a bit. Because in addition to all the judicial reforms in Israel, there was also an acceleration of settler violence on the West Bank of the River Jordan, which is ultimately the potential Palestinian state. And no one really challenged. Then you had an auction of extremes. And all of the moderate voices in Israel, where probably the majority of Israelis are moderate on this issue, and in Palestine, have been squeezed out. And I think that has been a contributory factor to the atrocity we've seen Hamas execute in Israel on October the 7th. So that's my point. So the other point really was saying that the Foreign Office needs to be re-empowered because a lot of this is just being done by a little group of people in Number 10. And now that we've got David Cameron there, I hope that the Foreign Office, in its more measured way, with a deeper historical understanding, can shape British policy in a much more mature manner.
I wonder if, there's a lot in what you said there, but I wonder actually if perhaps too much time has elapsed. Your argument is that that no one has sufficiently stood up to Israel, to Benjamin Netanyahu. Is it now possible for someone to come in, especially after what Hamas have done, executing, murdering 1,400 people, taking 240 people hostage? Is it now possible to kind of reset the narrative in that way? It feels that that's almost impossible.
Yes, it is. This is a dispute of many, many decades standing. Indeed, you could argue it goes back a century to Lawrence of Arabia and everything that's happened since the age of the Ottomans and the First World War. So, yes, you can go back, because if you don't go back to those principles, I think you're never, ever going to reach any kind of a sensible path towards an agreement on what happens to Palestine. Is it a state? Is it a one-state solution, a two-state solution? Is it ever going to be a solution to try and move 2.5 million people out of Gaza, or just push all the Palestinians out of the West Bank? No. So this does need to go back to those first principles of whose land is it.
Okay.
And I would urge David Cameron to be able to have that discussion, because actually it is a strong voice in Israel itself that is being silenced by not going back to that question.
Well, David Cameron said very famously, and he was quoted actually, even before he came back as Foreign Secretary by many people on the Palestinian side. They came on this programme and they said, your very own Prime Minister in 2010 called Gaza the biggest open-air prison. And that is something that he said. He's now Foreign Secretary. What's gone before him has been a very strong line from people like James Cleverly, backed up by people like Rishi Sunak, saying that, Israel... And they're talking very much about the response to the October the 7th attacks. Israel has a right to defend itself, and they haven't wavered from that. So how do you expect David Cameron to be any different, or to change that narrative?
You're quite right to say that inevitably the focus at the moment is on the response to what happened on October the 7th. But then you, in your very question, essentially leave hanging the question of what then, and what happens to 2 million people who are contained in a narrow strip of land at the end of the Mediterranean with nowhere else to go. Probably the most unpleasant interview I've heard was when someone said, why aren't they like Dubai? Well, I'll tell you why, because they're locked in. They've got not allowed an airport. They've got no resources. They're not allowed to exploit their own gas. You go through the crossing from Israel into Gaza and you change from a Mercedes to a donkey. This is a very, very different sort of place, and they are contained. And we're probably now down to the fifth generation of young children who have known nothing other than being stuck in this narrow strip of land with no resources and very little future or hope. So I've always resisted saying much about Gaza over the last 30 years because I think it is almost insoluble. It's very, very difficult to get to grips with. But the West Bank is very different because that's a bigger piece of land with Palestinians farming in there, and they're the ones who are getting bashed up all the time. So Gaza and the West Bank, both of which are not Israel and are Palestinian, are separate from each other and very, very different in their nature.
So do you think, just finally then, you drew the distinction there clearly, which is correct, that in terms of settler attacks on Palestinian people in recent weeks in the West Bank, do you actually think that is something that David Cameron will raise?
Well, I hope so. I think we all have to. I mean, it is going on almost every day. I mean, when I started being interested in this issue 35 years ago, there were probably about 50,000 settlers. I mean, settlers are people building their own houses and towns in another country, pushing out the people who are there. There are now probably 400, 500,000. So the prospects for a two-state solution are getting ever slimmer and more remote. So just saying, oh, we want a two-state solution isn't enough in the modern world because the problem has become more and more difficult. So, but yes, is the answer to your question. You have to focus on the original problem, which is that illegal Israeli settlers, often backed by the Israeli Defense Force, are pushing people out of their rightful land. And that is the essential origin of this problem. The Israelis would say that land is disputed, but international law says it is not. It is not Israeli. So if you go back to everything that's been happening in our streets, it's very important for people to recognize Israel, to admit it's a country. No one should question that. No one should be anti-Semitic. But the other side of that coin is that people should not question international law and the right of Palestinians to live on their own land.